The storm had been howling for hours now. Outside, the wind was a constant shriek, rattling the trees and sending waves of rain crashing against the windows of the cabin. Far from the safety of any civilization, the little structure stood alone, nestled deep in the woods. A small group of friends had rented it for the weekend, hoping for a peaceful escape from their daily lives. But something felt off the moment they arrived. The cabin was older than they had expected. The wood was cracked and weathered, and the air inside had a stale, musty smell, almost like it had been abandoned for years. Lena, the most practical of the group, immediately began unpacking, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. "It's just an old cabin, let's not make it weird," she muttered under her breath, as if convincing herself more than anyone else. Next to her, Chris, the skeptic of the group, gave the place a quick scan and shrugged. "It's fine, just a little rundown, that's all. Let's grab some drinks and head out to the lake. No need to get all dramatic about it." Sophie and Mark, the couple, lingered at the door, unsure. They exchanged uneasy glances, but the promise of relaxation still lingered. They hadn't come all the way out here just to turn back now. The walls of the cabin groaned, the wind pushing hard against the aged wood. The air was growing colder by the second. Something about it was unsettling, but they all tried to brush it off. "All right, let's explore a bit," Mark suggested, trying to break the tension. But as the group began to settle in, the silence of the forest outside seemed to wrap itself around them, thick and oppressive. The sound of their footsteps on the creaky floorboards echoed too loudly in the narrow space. It wasn't just the isolation or the storm that gave them an eerie feeling. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The kind of feeling that makes your skin prickle and your thoughts race. As they unpacked and chatted, the little creaks and cracks of the cabin, whispers from an unseen presence, seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. But when Sophie looked out the window at the vast, dense trees beyond, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The evening wore on, and the storm outside only intensified. The group of friends huddled around the fireplace, its warmth a meager comfort against the cold that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cabin. The occasional crack of thunder rattled the windows, but they were too caught up in conversation to notice much more. Mark had taken to telling a ghost story, something light-hearted, but his voice faltered when a sudden sound interrupted him, a faint tapping, almost like fingernails against the window pane. They all fell silent. Chris was the first to break the stillness. "It's probably just a branch. The storm's messing with the trees. Nothing to worry about," he said, though his tone was less certain than he'd like to admit. Sophie glanced over at Lena, who had stopped mid-sip, staring at the darkened window. "It's not the wind. It's something else," Lena muttered, her voice low and uncertain, but she quickly dismissed the thought. "I'm being silly, let's just get back to the fire." Still, the unease lingered. Just as they settled back into their conversation, the sound came again, louder this time, a distinct tap, 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 followed by a low, drawn-out scrape. It was coming from inside the cabin. Mark's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" His voice trembled ever so slightly. "I heard it too," Sophie whispered, her voice tight with fear. She stood up quickly, her eyes darting around the room as though expecting something, or someone, to appear from the shadows. The air in the cabin had changed. It felt thicker now, heavier. The fire seemed to flicker, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then, just as Lena reached for the fire poker, ready to investigate, the door to the small closet in the corner of the room creaked open on its own. They all froze. It was the closet door, the one they had checked earlier, ensuring it was empty. But now, it was open. Just a crack. The dark interior beyond seemed to swallow the dim light from the room. "Who opened that?" Chris's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes wide, fixed on the door. "It wasn't me," Lena stammered, her heart racing. "We all saw it was closed." "I saw it." The room seemed to grow colder. A draft swept through, but it didn't feel like a normal draft. It felt wrong. A shiver crawled up their spines, as if something invisible was creeping through the air, brushing against their skin. Mark took a deep breath, gathering courage. Okay, maybe there's a logical explanation. Let's just check the door. Reluctantly, they approached the closet, but just before they reached it, they all heard a voice. Soft at first, like a whisper in the distance, just outside the reach of their hearing. Then it grew louder, clearer. Come closer. The words felt like they were wrapped in ice, cold and chilling, yet the air itself was suffocatingly hot. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, taking a step back. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, trying to use the flashlight to pierce the shadows in the corner. But the beam flickered and cut out. The silence in the cabin was absolute now. No wind, no storm, no sound at all, just the oppressive weight of something unseen. Sophie felt a chill run through her, deeper than any draft. "We should leave," she said urgently, her eyes wide. "Now! There's something here!" But Lena wasn't listening. She was staring at the closet. There, just beyond the door, the faintest trace of movement, a shadow, a figure. I think I saw something," Lena whispered, voice quivering. "In there!" She didn't wait for a response. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark reached for her, but it was too late. She was already inside the closet, looking around. Seconds stretched into eternity. Lena's breath hitched. There, hanging from the far wall of the closet, was a small yellowed piece of paper, its edges curled with age. It was pinned with a single rusty nail. Sophie gasped. "What is that?" Lena gingerly reached for the paper, almost as if drawn to it. She pulled it free from the nail and opened it with trembling hands. The words written on the paper were frantic, scribbled in dark ink. "I hear them. They speak when I sleep. They tell me things. Bad things. Don't listen to them." Lena's breath caught in her throat as she read the words aloud. Suddenly the room felt colder, the shadows deeper, and from somewhere beyond the cabin, beneath the floor, within the walls, a low guttural growl echoed. The air was thick with dread, and Lena, without thinking, slammed the closet door shut. "That's it, we're leaving, now," Mark demanded, moving towards the door with urgency. But as he reached for the handle, something stopped him. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper drifted from the shadows. Mark tugged at the handle, his face growing pale with fear. "Come on, open!" His voice cracked as he yanked again. But no matter how hard he pulled, the door remained stubbornly shut. It was as if something on the other side, something powerful, was holding it fast. The group stood frozen in the dim light of the flickering fire, the eerie stillness of the cabin now palpable. Lena and Sophie stood at the back of the room, their eyes wide with terror, as the dark growl that had reverberated through the walls slowly faded into a chilling silence. But the silence was far from comforting. It was an oppressive, suffocating thing, the air itself thick with fear. "What the hell is going on?" Chris whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own racing heartbeat. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting someone, to step out of the shadows at any moment. Sophie's hands were shaking, her breath shallow. "This place, it's not just old. It's wrong. It's like it's alive." She looked at the others, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Right now." But Lena, the most determined among them, was already at the windows, trying to pry open the heavy shutters. The storm outside was still relentless, but the windows didn't open. They were sealed shut, impossibly sealed. "It's locked. All of them," Lena said, backing away slowly. Her voice was tight, like she was speaking through a wall of fear. She turned back to the others. "It's like the house is trapping us." Mark stepped back from the door, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. His mouth was dry. "We're overreacting. The storm's just messing with us. This is nothing more than a draft and an old building." But even as he spoke, something inside him was starting to doubt. The fear was spreading, taking root in his mind, and it was clear that none of them were really convinced anymore. Lena looked over at the fireplace, the only source of warmth in the room, and gasped. The flames were dancing unnaturally. They flickered too brightly, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to twist and stretch across the room. Suddenly, the shadows on the walls began to move. No one spoke. No one moved. They were all too paralyzed by the sight, too stunned by what was happening. The shadows crept across the floor like dark tendrils, reaching out toward the group. Chris was the first to break the silence. "Did you see that? Did you see?" Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen, the sound of something heavy being knocked to the floor. Without thinking, Lena rushed toward the hallway. The others followed her in a silent, terrified line, their footsteps muffled by the creaking floorboards. In the kitchen, a single chair had fallen over, its wooden frame splintered slightly, but it was the mark on the floor that caught their attention. A smear of dark, wet liquid streaking across the hardwood. "I didn't hear anything," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It couldn't have happened like this. It didn't make sense." They hadn't heard the chair move. The floorboards hadn't creaked under any weight. But now, the liquid on the floor was unmistakable, too dark, too thick, like blood. And it was still spreading, as though whatever it was had a life of its own. Is this real?" Mark's voice was hoarse, cracked with panic. He couldn't bring himself to bend down to touch it, but the horrible truth was already settling over him. Chris, trying to steady himself, reached out to touch the pool of liquid. "Don't," Lena hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't." She stopped herself, her face pale with dread. "It's not safe. It's not real." But Chris didn't listen. His hand hovered over the dark stain, his breath shallow. And then, without warning, his hand plunged into it. A screech of agony split the air. Chris jerked his hand back in horror, his eyes wide with shock. The liquid was burning. It had seared his skin in an instant, and the skin on his palm was already blistering, red and raw. "What the hell?" Sophie screamed, pulling him back. "What is going on?" The growl they had heard earlier returned, but this time it was louder, closer. It felt as if something was right behind them, breathing down their necks. And then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway, slow and measured, like someone or something was moving toward them with purpose. Mark turned to look behind him. The hallway was empty, the shadows long and ominous, but the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer, step by step. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "We can't stay here. We have to—" Before she could finish her sentence, the footsteps grew louder, as though something was rushing toward them. They weren't the sound of feet on the floor. No, these were the sounds of claws dragging across the wood. Lena's eyes widened in terror. The last thing she saw before the lights flickered and went out completely was the shape, a dark, hulking figure standing at the end of the hall, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The air was suffocating now. The pressure was unbearable. And then everything went still. The power cut out abruptly, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace, which crackled and sputtered, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were waiting for something to move. Lena, her pulse racing, reached for the matches, desperately trying to light another candle. The wind outside howled in the distance, but inside the cabin felt suffocatingly still. "We need to get out of here," Chris muttered, his voice hoarse with pain and fear. His hand still throbbed from the burn, the blistered skin reddening as he held it against his chest. But the door, every door, remained stubbornly locked. "There has to be an answer to this," Mark said, his voice shaking, but he was trying to stay calm. "We're not stuck here forever. There's got to be a way out." But deep down they all knew that wasn't true. They were trapped, and whatever was in this place with them, it wasn't just some freak accident or a series of strange coincidences. It was something real. Lena shivered and turned to look around the room. The shadows seemed to press closer, swirling like smoke, and she felt like she could hear faint whispering in the corners of the room. Borgel felt they were dead, and likely the demons was too. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp, eyes wide as she turned to the others. But before anyone could respond, something caught her attention. A small crack in the wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Over here," she said quietly, walking toward the wall where the crack had appeared. It ran from the baseboard to just beneath the ceiling, almost as if something had been pushed behind it. "What is it?" Sophie asked, her voice full of dread. "What's behind it?" Lena reached out to touch the crack, and as soon as her fingers brushed the rough surface, there was a soft click. "Ah!" Sound so faint, none of them could be sure if they had really heard it, but the wall shifted. With a low groan, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. The faint flickering candlelight revealed the shape of an old dusty chest, tucked into the space. It had been sealed for a long time, covered in cobwebs and grime. Lena's heart pounded. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the answer to what was going on here. "What is that?" Mark asked, stepping closer, his curiosity now overcoming his fear. Lena knelt down and tugged at the latch of the chest. It creaked open with a protesting sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Inside, she found what she expected: old, weathered papers and books. But what caught her eye first were the strange symbols drawn hastily on yellowed pages, covered in a script she couldn't understand. "What the hell is this?" Sophie whispered, peering over Lena's shoulder. Lena flipped through the pages, scanning the text, and then froze. At the very back of the chest, there was something else. A small, intricately carved box. It was made of dark wood, and the surface was covered in cryptic runes. Sophie reached for the box. "Don't!" Lena said sharply, but Sophie was already holding it in her hands. "What is it?" Sophie asked, turning it over to inspect the engravings. The box was heavy, oddly warm to the touch. There was a strange pull to it, like it was calling out to her. Lena felt an inexplicable wave of panic. "Put it down," she insisted, but it was too late. Sophie had already pried open the lid. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Sophie gasped and pulled it free, revealing a withered, human-shaped figure. Its features twisted in a grotesque grimace. It was small, almost doll-like, with brittle limbs and hollow eyes carved from dark stone. "What the hell is this thing?" Chris asked, his voice shaking. Lena stood frozen, her heart racing. "It's a doll! But why would it be here? Why would anyone leave something like this?" Mark stepped closer, his hand hovering over the object. It feels wrong. It's too alive." But the moment his fingers brushed against the doll, the room seemed to pulse. An unnatural, suffocating pulse, as if the house itself were breathing. "Get rid of it!" Lena shouted, backing away from the chest. But the damage had already been done. The whispers began, soft at first, barely audible, but then growing louder. "Come closer." The voice was not human. It wasn't even an echo. It came from inside their minds, as if the very walls of the cabin were speaking to them. Lena staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows in the room had grown darker, more solid, and the flickering light from the candles cast grotesque shapes on the walls. The doll, still resting in Sophie's hands, moved, just a little, but enough to make their blood run cold. Sophie dropped the doll in horror, and the moment it hit the floor, a loud, dissonant bang echoed from somewhere deep within the house. The walls seemed to tremble. "Run!" Mark screamed, but they didn't need to be told. They turned and bolted toward the front door, but as they reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening thud, trapping them in place. And then the growls returned, this time closer, louder. A dark, guttural noise from behind them, coming from the hallway. Lena turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The thing that had been watching them was finally here. Mark shoved his shoulder against it, his muscles straining, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's locked!" It's locked! His voice was frantic as he banged his fists against the heavy wooden door. The growl had stopped, but the air in the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating. The flickering candles cast sharp, elongated shadows on the walls, each one twisted into something sinister. The quiet was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. Lena, her pulse racing, turned to face the others. "We're not getting out that way. The house, it won't let us." Her voice trembled, but she was trying to keep her composure. They had to think. They couldn't panic. Sophie, shaking with fear, looked around the room, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. "What do you mean, Lena? The door's just stuck, right? It's just the storm making everything worse." But Lena shook her head, stepping back from the door. "No, this isn't just the storm. Something's here, and it's not letting us leave." Chris stumbled back from the window, his face ashen. "I can't see anything out there. It's like the whole forest is gone. It's just black, like a wall of nothing." His voice faltered. The storm outside had stopped. The wind had died down completely, leaving a suffocating stillness behind. The silence felt unnatural, too perfect, too absolute. Mark turned to Lena, his voice low. "What are we supposed to do? We're trapped in here, and that thing is out there. That growl." The thought of the growl, that guttural, animalistic noise, made their skin crawl. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something ancient, something that had been here long before they had arrived. Lena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. Then, without warning, she turned toward the hallway. "We need to find another way out. There has to be another door, a basement, a way—" "Lena, no," Sophie called out, her voice full of panic. "It's too dangerous. Whatever's out there, we're safer in here. We need to stay together." But Lena's determination was absolute. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this house with them, whatever was making the shadows move, making the doors refuse to open, wasn't just a force of nature. It was alive, and it was hunting them. She glanced at the others, her voice desperate. "We're not safe here. Trust me, we have to keep moving." But before they could make another move, the lights flickered. The flame in the fireplace sputtered, dying out completely. The entire cabin was plunged into darkness. The darkness felt wrong. The air grew colder, so much colder. Lena fumbled for the matches, her hands trembling as she struck one, the flame flickering weakly before she managed to light a new candle. The soft glow cast long shadows on the walls, but it barely cut through the oppressive blackness, and that's when they heard it. A faint scratching noise, like claws against wood. Slow, deliberate, from the corner of the room. Mark's eyes went wide. "It's in here! It's in the damn room with us!" Lena's heart hammered in her chest. "Everyone stay still, don't move, don't make a sound." They all held their breath, straining to hear anything beyond the soft crackling of the candle. The scratching sound grew louder, closer. And then, without warning, a soft, deep voice whispered from the shadows, "You cannot leave. You are already mine." The words were low and slithering, like something that had crawled up from the very depths of the earth. "Oh God," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. It's real, we're going to die here." Suddenly the candle flickered and went out. The room was completely dark again, the growl louder this time, closer. It vibrated through their bones. Then, out of nowhere, a door at the far end of the cabin slammed open. No one had touched it, no one had even been near it, and standing in the doorway, a figure, a silhouette. It was huge, taller than any human could be. The shape was hunched, dark and monstrous, its outline barely discernible against the pitch-black hallway, but the eyes. Those were unmistakable, two glowing pinpricks of red light, flickering like embers in the dark. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. It was gone, like it had never been there at all. They all gasped in unison, taking instinctive steps back. But they didn't dare take their eyes off the doorway. "What the hell is going on?" Chris muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it? What was that thing?" Lena felt a wave of dread wash over her, a cold, hollow feeling that sank deep into her chest. "We're not alone," she said quietly, her voice thick with fear. "It's in the house with us. It's been here a long time, and it won't let us leave." Sophie took a shaky breath. I told you we shouldn't have come here." Mark's face was pale. He looked from the dark doorway to the group, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. "We're not safe anywhere," Lena said, her eyes locked on the door, her voice steady but full of dread. "We need to find a way to stop it, whatever it is." But just as she spoke those words, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The chill was so sharp it hurt to breathe. The woman couldn't linger around. The chill was so sharp it hurt to breathe. The woman couldn't linger around, she said. The chill was so sharp it hurt to breathe. And then, from all around them, came the whispers. Soft at first, but growing louder. "Come closer." They could hear it clearly now. The voice was low, twisted, hungry. "Don't listen," Lena whispered urgently, pulling the others away from the door. "It wants us to come to it. It's trying to lure us." But the whispers continued, the sound rising to a deafening roar. It was coming. Whatever it was coming. And they were running out of time.